Do you have to go to the new mass? We're going to hear a response from somebody who argues no, and then I am going to offer a rebuttal. Stay tuned for more.
You're watching Reason and Theology Live, a show dedicated to charitable discussions, debates, interviews, commentary, and analysis. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
All right, so welcome back to Reason and Theology. Your host, Michael. I want to offer a response to a video that was recently put out. I was asked by a friend to engage this video, and I was happy to oblige. The title of the video is "Do You Have to Go to the New Mass Q&A Response" by Kennedy Hall. I wanted to interact with it because I used to hold to the same position that Kennedy espouses in the video. I read the same sources. I used to be a really big fan of Michael Davies, who he relies heavily on in the video, or Monsignor Gamber, and also Lefebvre himself. I greatly admired these men and read a lot of their works. And so I'm familiar with the position that he espouses in the video because I used to hold to it myself. What I found to be a helpful cure for it, however, was a thorough study of the history of the Roman Rite, not just a superficial study, but an in-depth study of the history of the Roman Rite. When I saw how many changes it went through and then compared that to the changes in the post-conciliar period and just applied the logic consistently, I said that, okay, well, some of the criticisms that I used to have against the post-conciliar reforms could be leveled against aspects to the Roman Rite in the pre-conciliar era. Some of those criticisms, not all. I still have some criticisms of the Roman Rite in the post-conciliar era. But I also have some criticisms of the pre-conciliar Roman Rite, depending on what era we're talking about, because as I said, the Roman Rite has undergone a lot of development. So that partly helped cure me of some of the arguments that we're going to hear from Kennedy that I myself used to use. And also a study of the magisterium really helped me to put things into better perspective. So while I may have, again, some criticisms of the Roman Rite in both the pre-conciliar era and post-conciliar era, depending on what we're talking about, I still want to argue that those who think that the liturgy in the post-conciliar era in the Roman Rite is somehow harmful to souls, a grave offense to God, should not be attended, they are seriously in error. And of course, this is something that those who are in the Society of St. Pius X, many of them at least, espouse, as I showed recently in a video called "My Concerns with the SSPX and Marcel Lefebvre," where I demonstrate this and I also interact with it and show the problems with this. So go and watch that if you haven't seen it already. Now, one thing that we're going to see throughout the video is this constant accusation that there's a spirit of Protestantism in the post-conciliar liturgy in the Roman Rite. And that's not really defined. What do we actually mean by that? And what do we mean by Protestantism here? I mean, obviously, it's going to be identified as a heresy because it is a heresy. But when people say the liturgy is filled with the spirit of Protestantism, they don't tend to be very specific in what they mean. And some of the things that they may point us to, such as maybe an emphasis on community, is actually not something that is heretical. And so it would be inappropriate to call it the spirit of Protestantism because that emphasis is not foreign to the Catholic tradition. If Protestants have that, it's because they got that from Catholics. But that's not synonymous with the heresies of Protestantism. So any of the heresies of Protestantism, you won't find present in the Roman Rite in the post-conciliar era. You won't find those there. But unfortunately, I think they're equivocating here and also being vague whenever they level this accusation, which we'll see here as we go through the video. But I also want to point out, I think it's a little ironic that there is a charge of a spirit of Protestantism, because if I had to say what Protestantism was as far as a spirit of Protestantism, I would say it's dissent from church authority. And ironically, those who are accusing the post-conciliar liturgy of having this spirit of Protestantism tend to be part of the Society of St. Pius X, which is guilty of this exact thing, a dissent against church authority, lawful authority. So the spirit of Protestantism is certainly there in the founder of Marcel Lefebvre, or the founder of the Society of St. Pius X, Marcel Lefebvre, and also those who formally adhere to the Society of St. Pius X. There's this spirit of dissent against proper and lawful church authority. And so I find it ironic that this is brought up usually by the very people who have this exact problem themselves. That being said, I still want to address their claims without just simply pointing out to the irony here. Okay, let's start with maybe 9 minutes and 40 seconds into the video. I'm going to share my screen and let's dive in.
However, there's a reason why the church has always insisted, or at least to the best of her ability, depending on the circumstance, insisted on uniformity of the particular liturgies.
The church has not always done this. We could certainly say that around the time of the Protestant Reformation, the church really started to centralize the liturgy, at least in the Roman churches. And so it did start to insist on uniformity there to an extent. It did allow for some latitude here and there, but it did start to really insist on uniformity in that era because there were a lot of Protestants who were just kind of all over the place with their liturgical innovations. But for the vast majority of history, the church hasn't had this kind of centralized liturgy. It was very, very much local. So I kind of challenge this notion that the church has always insisted on uniformity. I'm not so sure that that's the case in the history of the liturgy.
It's so that there is no risk of there being a defective or inefficient or deficient or dangerous theology imbibed in the people. If you pick up your missal, if you pick up your Roman missal and you compare the new Mass to the old Mass, they're clearly in different universes.
First of all, I have to say, what do we mean by old Mass? Because I suspect what he's talking about as the old Mass is just one particular form of the Roman Rite. He's probably referring to the liturgy of John the 23rd or some variation, from the Council of Trent unto that time. And again, there have been variations there. But there have been plenty of other forms, if you will, to the Roman Rite, or there have been plenty developments and changes made to the Roman Rite way before the Council of Trent. Here I'm thinking especially of St. Gregory the Great, who significantly truncated the Roman canon. Not to mention that we have significant changes between the liturgies in the first century and the liturgies that came after that. Significantly different. So when we say old Mass, I fear that a lot of people, when they say that, they're assuming that the liturgy was just kind of one way prior to the conciliar reforms, and then after that, everything just changed. And I don't think that that fully appreciates a lot of the developments and changes that have been made to the Roman Rite historically. Now, he says that they're in completely different universes. Whatever differences you want to point to between the Roman Rite in the post-conciliar era versus the Roman Rite in the pre-conciliar era in, let's say, the Missal of John the 23rd, whatever differences you want to point to, they are not as significant as the differences that we have between the Missal that Pius V gives us at the time of the Council of Trent compared to the liturgy in the first century in Jerusalem. The amount of differences between the first century liturgies and the Roman Rite by the time of the Council of Trent are incredibly significant. And they would, in my opinion, outweigh any of the differences between the Missal of Paul VI in the post-conciliar era versus that of John the 23rd in the pre-conciliar era. So my problem here is when we point to some of these accidental differences between the missals and say that they're in different universes. Okay, well, what universe is the Council of Trent in when we go and compare it to first century liturgies? I mean, 3 universes different? I mean, how do we assess this? What are we going to say about the differences between first century liturgies and the Council of Trent in light of this paradigm that, you know, the universes here between 23rd and Paul VI are just so significantly different? Okay, let's continue.
It's not just translated into English or Spanish or Italian, whatever language you go to mass in. It's a completely different liturgy as far as the expressed intention based on the types of prayers that are said.
I challenge all of that. I challenge all that. I think that there's a substantial consistency there between the Missal of John the 23rd and Paul VI in the expressed intention. Certainly, when we compare it to the amount of differences that we would have between the Missal of John the 23rd compared to a first or second century liturgy in Rome or Jerusalem.
The spiritual atmosphere that it creates for the person, the profundity of the nature of sacrifice. I mean,
what kind of spiritual atmosphere do you think the agape feast liturgies created for people? You think it was in the same wavelength as people who are using the Missal of John the 23rd, or even the liturgy that Pius V promulgated at the time of the Council of Trent? Do you think that they're on the same wavelength as the atmosphere that you would experience in a first century agape feast liturgy? I'm pretty sure those are in 2 different universes. Now, me as a Catholic, I can say there's still substantial agreement with all of these liturgies, not only in the Roman Rite, but also with all the Eastern liturgies. There's substantial agreement here because the substance is effectively going to be the sacrament itself. But aside from that, there are all kinds of liturgical variations between East and West, and with West and the West with itself. And there are plenty of different atmospheres, liturgical atmospheres from these variations in the liturgy. And that's legitimate.
You follow these things through and you find yourself in very different liturgical settings. This is why in the new Mass, in most cases, there has been a Protestant spirituality that has imbibed itself.
And unfortunately, he's not really going to clarify what he means by this. He's going to give a vague reference to Michael Davies and his works, but he's not going to go into any kind of specifics. So I can't address any specifics because he doesn't raise them. However, I suspect he's referring to questions of sacrifice and language of sacrifice, because that tends to be what this crowd generally harps on, especially Michael Davies. And so, first of all, I would point out that the language there of sacrificial, that sacrificial language is still there. But he would probably argue that, well, it's not as prevalent. Okay. Would it have also been as prevalent as it's expressed in the Missal of John the 23rd? Would that sacrificial language have been just as prevalent in first century Jerusalem? Is there any evidence that that was the case? We have vague references here and there to the concept of sacrifice, but it's certainly not the emphasis in the liturgy at that time. It's there, but it's not the emphasis. So whenever somebody says, okay, look, there's this spirit of Protestantism here, unfortunately, I think they're vague. And the instances that they would point me to, I think one can just turn them right back around and point to some aspects of the early church and say, well, look, these things weren't emphasized there either. And one of the earliest people to use this argument against the Reformed liturgy was Ottaviani. And I showed in a previous video, it's called "Did Cardinal Ottaviani Reject the New Mass?" I show in that video that he changed his position on that and said that, no, okay, my criticisms about the Reformed liturgy were off base, and he corrects that. Let's continue.
You know, this is not something you have to have a PhD to understand. In fact, PhDs are probably not as commonsensical about these sorts of things. But the new Mass has a Protestant spirit imbibed in it. This is part of the formation of it. This is part of the formulation of the new Mass. This is part of the history books. The folks at Mass of the Ages showed this, but this was seen long before in the works of Michael Davies. This is why Archbishop Lefebvre warned against going to the new Mass, because what it did is it imbibed a Protestant spirit.
And as I showed in the previous video that I referenced earlier about my concerns of the SSPX and Marcel Lefebvre, they say that a liturgy, a Novus Ordo that's done reverently, not an abuse, is an offense to God. Let that sink in. And that's the party line that Kennedy here is expressing. And I want to say that's a very, very dangerous view, because now it's saying the church can promulgate a liturgy that is harmful to souls and an offense to God. Let that sink in.
And why is that? Because the emphasis in the new Mass liturgical framework is on the community, and it is on the corporal nature of people being there, experiencing some sort of thing where they are part of the mystical body of Christ.
All right, so he's saying, look, the difference here is there's now an emphasis that goes presumably from an emphasis on sacrifice, that's generally what they say, to an emphasis on community. Now, as I've said, the emphasis, well, the expression of sacrifice is still there, just as it was in the early church. But what you have in the Roman Rite is a restoration of the emphasis on community. I would grant that. But that's a restoration. That's not a deviation. It was more the Roman Rite as enshrined in the Missal of Pius V and John the 23rd, where you have a deviation from any emphasis on community. That was the more innovative liturgical expression. And so what the post-conciliar liturgy is trying to do is restore things to how it actually was emphasized in the early church. And the emphasis was on community. I mean, one of the earliest terms that we have for the liturgy is synaxis, the holy synaxis. That means assembly. The emphasis is on the assembly. They weren't denying the sacrificial nature of the Eucharist. They weren't denying that. That's there in the early church. But it certainly wasn't the emphasis. So this concept of assembly, it's thoroughly biblical, and that's definitely where the emphasis is liturgically in the New Testament and also in the early church. It's not devoid of sacrificial language for the Eucharist. That's where Protestants go wrong. So whenever he speaks here of this kind of deficiency, a Protestant spirituality in the liturgy, I want to point out that, wait, Protestantism denies the Eucharistic sacrifice. That language is still in the Roman Rite in the post-conciliar era. No Protestant could be at a Catholic Mass and hear that in good conscience and be okay with it. The Reformed liturgy is still very Catholic and has all kinds of Catholic elements in it that no Protestant could be comfortable with, including sacrificial language. The era of Protestantism is a rejection of that sacrificial language. But again, the Roman Rite in the post-conciliar era doesn't reject it. It's just, again, putting the emphasis back on community, because that is the emphasis of the liturgy in the New Testament itself. Think of here an agape feast. What do you think the emphasis is in an agape feast? I mean, and many other instances can be called to mind here. And so, yeah, whenever Protestants point this out and say, but hey, your Roman Rite liturgy completely de-emphasizes this aspect of community, that's a legitimate criticism, because in the Roman Rite, it did de-emphasize participation of the faithful throughout history. But that participation of the faithful in community is biblical and very, very patristic. That is thoroughly traditional. And what they were trying to do in the Roman Rite is restore that. Now, whether or not they've been very successful in practice is a different question. That was certainly the intention. And that's certainly what the rubrics are calling for, not a denial of the Eucharistic sacrifice. And so here I'm just talking about the liturgy as it's properly done. I'm not talking about abuses. I know there are abuses where people try to just scrub everything that's Catholic. I'm not defending any of that. I'm just specifically talking about those who are trying to engage the Roman Rite in the post-conciliar era as it's considered objectively. That's what I'm dealing with. Now, let's flip this around. Some legitimate criticisms that I think should be brought against the Roman Rite, and were being brought against the Roman Rite at the time of the post-conciliar, or at the time of the conciliar reform of the liturgy, is you have a de-emphasis of the resurrection, a de-emphasis of divination or divinization and theosis. You have a de-emphasis of community and participation of the faithful. Those are all biblical and traditional, and they are de-emphasized in the Roman Rite over a long period of time. Does that somehow mean that the Roman Rite is guilty of heresy? No, but there was a deviation from these things in emphasis, not in substance. These things are there in the Roman Rite. In the preconciliar era, you can't just say that, oh, they're just completely devoid, like some Orthodox would argue. No, you still have theosis and community and things like that in the Roman Rite, even in the preconciliar era. It's just that they are de-emphasized. But upon what basis do you say, okay, well, it's wrong to de-emphasize the sacrificial language of the Eucharist, but not then critique the Roman Rite for de-emphasizing theosis and community and participation of the faithful? Are those not part of divine revelation? Are those not part of sacred tradition? Well, they certainly are. So I think when we go down this road, there might be a legitimate criticism to say, you know what, I think that there needs to be in the post-conciliar era more of an emphasis on the sacrificial language of the Eucharist. Okay, that's legit. I think you're probably right. There probably needs to be a little bit more. But you know what? If you're going to go down that road, just apply it consistently about the preconciliar liturgy in other areas like theosis, community, and participation of the faithful.
That's the emphasis. Think about the Eucharistic prayers and the prefaces and things that you've heard. Now compare that to the Old Mass, where it's about sacrifice, it's about atonement, it's about all the different realities of why Mass is done.
In some forms of the Roman Rite, in certain periods of Roman Rite history, I'm not sure that was always the case. A first century liturgy in Rome would probably not have had that much emphasis on Eucharistic sacrifice compared to emphasis on community, participation of the faithful, and other aspects.
So that's baseline. So that's why we have to contrast these two liturgies, and we need to understand those things before we would even consider the question of, well, should you avoid it?
All right, so let's skip to the 19-minute mark here.
The reason is because what is the point of going to Mass? So Mass is offered by the priest because there is the Mass is offered for various reasons: sacrifice, repentance, atonement, that sort of thing. But why do we attend? We attend because that's the way, normally speaking, that we sanctify the Lord's Day. We don't attend. The precept of the church has never been, you have to receive every Sunday and Holy Day of Obligation. We don't go to Mass in order to receive Holy Communion as a rule. That's not the case. You don't have to receive as a rule. You're supposed to receive once during Easter time as per the church law. So it's not even like we're going because we are required to receive Holy Communion. The reason why we're required to attend Mass, normally speaking, is to sanctify the Lord's Day. So the purpose of that law is to serve the highest law, which is to sanctify the Lord's Day. To keep.
That was one of the most deficient explanations of the liturgy I have ever heard. The irony here is he is saying there's this deficiency in sacrificial language, but the deficiency that we see here in Kennedy in the participation of the faithful is just glaring. He sees the Mass as something that primarily the priest does. Now, I certainly say that it's principally something that the priest does, but he sees it so emphasized on the priest that he can't even figure out why the laity even have to go to the liturgy. He's sitting here trying to figure out why. Well, the only reason why I can think of, it's not for reception of communion, as he's going to say. It's not for that, but it's simply to fulfill the obligation. That's one of the most doctrinally deficient understandings of the liturgy I've ever heard. And it's because there is a de-emphasis of community and participation of the faithful in the Roman expression that Kennedy holds as the ideal. Let me take a stab at it. Why do the faithful go to the liturgy? For us to be divinized through the partaking of communion. That's one huge reason. He's going to say, well, you're not even required to take communion. Well, isn't that part of the problem? You might not be required, but in the early church, you were expected, if you were at the liturgy, to receive the Eucharist. Why? Because that's the primary purpose, is for you to be divinized through the sacraments. Another huge reason why, it's not to fulfill just the Sunday obligation. The reason why we go is so that we can join in the sacrificial offering and offer ourselves as a living sacrifice of praise in union with the Holy Eucharistic sacrifice. He misses that entirely. It's so de-emphasized in the expression of the Roman rite that he's familiar with that he doesn't even know why they go to liturgy aside from fulfilling a Mass obligation. That's how painfully obvious this deficiency in his liturgical understanding is. Nothing about being divinized, partaking of divinity and having your nature elevated through the sacraments. Nothing about that. Nothing about offering yourself as a living sacrifice and offering a sacrifice of praise, which is incredibly biblical and patristic. None of that. It's just, well, it's so that we can fulfill our Sunday obligation. And so if you're going to criticize a deficiency in expressing sacrificial language in the post-conciliar liturgy, upon what basis do you not also criticize a de-emphasis of participation of community and faithful and divinization and all of that? Be consistent. You have a lack of participation of the faithful so much that infants don't even have a role in the liturgy in the Roman rite anymore. They abandoned the notion of communion for infants long ago and chrismation for infants because they can't really see a need for it. Because again, there's this de-emphasis of participation and a de-emphasis of theosis. But if there's more of an emphasis on theosis and participation, you would say, well, that's why we give communion to infants. Again, I'll go to bat for the Latin Rite Catholics, however, and say the Orthodox who are saying that whenever Latin Rite Catholics don't give communion to infants, they're depriving people of heaven, as if this is a heaven or hell issue. I'll go to bat for the Latin Rite Catholics and say, no, you're going too far. Because they do baptize infants and they receive all the graces they need for heaven in that baptism. But be consistent is all I'm saying. And what I see from guys like this, like Kennedy, who buy into this stuff, they buy into this kind of argumentation against the post-conciliar liturgical reforms, but they don't then consistently apply that elsewhere to the history of the Roman Rite. And that's why I'm saying when you study the history of the Roman Rite, it will really cure you of a lot of these arguments. And I want to point to a couple examples here from the Liturgy of St. James, just one liturgy. It's very, very old. Listen to the emphasis here on sacrifice of praise. It says, Sovereign Lord Jesus Christ, O Word of God, who freely offered yourself a blameless sacrifice upon the cross to God, even the Father. So it's talking about Jesus offering himself as a sacrifice. The coal of a double nature that touched the lips of the prophet with the tongues. He's talking about Isaiah. And took away his sins. Touch also the hearts of us sinners and purify from us every stain. And present us holy beside your holy altar, that we may offer you a sacrifice of praise. So this notion of a sacrifice of praise is united to the sacrifice of Christ. So whenever we speak of us joining in the sacrifice through the liturgy, we're not denying what Jesus did or what takes place on the altar by the hands of the priest. We're saying that we offer ourselves as a living sacrifice in union with that. But that's de-emphasized in the preconciliar liturgy, and the postconciliar liturgy rightly attempted to restore that. Continuing with the Liturgy of St. James, it says, Lord, have mercy on us, since we are full of fear and trembling, when about to stand at your holy altar and offer this dread and bloodless sacrifice for our own sins. So here you have a reference to the bloodless sacrifice of the Eucharist. But then watch this. And for the heirs of the people, send forth, O God, your good grace, and sanctify our souls, bodies, and spirits, and turn our thoughts to holiness, that with a pure conscience we may bring to you a peace offering, the sacrifice of praise. Once again, sacrifice of praise, being united with that Eucharistic sacrifice. Again, that's what the Roman liturgy in the postconciliar era is trying to restore. That's not a deviation. That's actually a restoration. It speaks also of the offering of peace, the sacrifice of praise in the Liturgy of St. James. You have the same language being used also in the Liturgy of Chrysostom. This is also why I honestly believe you want a major cure for the kind of critique that you're going to hear from Kennedy Hall against the Roman Rite in the postconciliar era. Attend consistently an Eastern liturgy. Attend the Byzantine liturgy consistently, and you will appreciate the post-conciliar Roman Rite so much more. And you will find the pre-conciliar Roman Rite, as expressed in John the 23rd and also Pius V, you'll find that to be a little bit more foreign. And one other point that I want to bring up here is from 1 Corinthians 10:17, and you can find it in many other places. But here you have an emphasis, a liturgical emphasis on unity with others in the synaxis, in the liturgy. Certainly, principally, our aim in the liturgy is union with God. That's through the reception of the sacrament, which Kennedy seems to very much de-emphasize. Well, if you want to emphasize unity with God and put the focus on God, the principal way to do that is through reception of the Eucharist, which again he downplays and was very much downplayed in the preconciliar era. By the time, after the Council of Trent, you have periods in time where the faithful are receiving so infrequently that they're no longer receiving during the liturgy. So you do have this emphasis on unity with God, but also unity with each other. And you see this in Scripture. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10:17, for we, being many, are one bread, one body, all that partake of one bread. The emphasis here is on us gathering together as a community and being united as one through the Holy Eucharist. You have that emphasis of community there strongly in the New Testament. And the emphasis on a Eucharistic sacrifice is not as strong. It's there implicitly, but it's not as strong. So again, if you're going to criticize post-conciliar Roman Rite liturgy for having that sacrificial language, but being not as strong as community, then you have to do the same thing for St. Paul in the first century liturgy.
But I'll tell you why traditionalists, especially from the Society of St. Pius X, don't go to the new Mass as a rule.
Not only do they not go to the new Mass as a rule, they discourage anybody from going to it.
It is because, as I mentioned earlier, there is a Protestant spirit that is imbibed in the new Mass. And this is not just conjecture. This was baked into the cake. Again, go watch Mass.
So again, that's where they hang their hat. The main reason why they're going to say you shouldn't go to the Novus Ordo, even when it's properly done, not abuses, even when it's properly done, because Kennedy is going to admit later on in the majority of instances that he has been to when it comes to liturgy. It's at the 56-minute mark. He admits his experience with the Novus Ordo. It's not crazy. It's not a bunch of clown masses. He said they've been relatively normal. But the reason why he still wouldn't go to these Novus Ordos is because he's already bought into this notion of what the Society of St. Pius X teaches, that it has the heresy of Protestantism in it, and that it's an offense to God. So he's going to say, well, I'm not going to go and participate in something that's heretical in tone and atmosphere and is an offense to God.
Pages, episode 2. That's nothing new in that documentary, but it's wonderfully laid out. So you don't have to go read some big books. You can see the Coles notes there.
So that's, again, where he hangs his hat on that. And I just simply challenge that. He's not giving us anything specific, so I can't answer anything specific at the moment, though.
Catholics traditionally, there's no salvation outside the church. So, to be honest, I think that's what they were hoping for at the Second Vatican Council with the new Mass. After the Second Vatican Council with the new Mass, I think they were hoping for the hippie Jesus thing to take off. It never did. But my point is, it is a Protestant paradigm.
He thinks that the bishops on the whole were hoping for a hippie Mass. Bishops who were trained in the preconciliar era in the manualist tradition and who grew up with the missal that he is so fond of. That's interesting.
So, what is Protestantism? Well, Protestantism is a heresy. It's a bunch of different heresies, but it's not Catholic.
So it's being implied that if you have the spirit of Protestantism here in the Reformed liturgy, you have the spirit of heresy in it.
We believe as Catholics traditionally that there's no salvation outside the church. So we wouldn't want to imbibe in ourselves a spirit of heresy that would lead us to leave the church. And again, you can debate the...
So he believes that there's a spirit behind the post-conciliar liturgy that is Protestant that would make you want to leave the church.
But if you want to, go read Michael Davies' series on the liturgy. I believe it's a trilogy.
And my cure for Michael Davies will be to study the history of the Roman Rite, especially compare it to the liturgy in the first century, in the liturgies that you would see in that era. And then also attend Eastern liturgies in communion with Rome consistently and study the magisterium.
I looked into what Martin Luther said about the Mass and all of the innovations that he did, communion on...
Yeah, I find it interesting he's appealing to Martin Luther here because I see a whole lot of similarities in Martin Luther's dissent against the papacy and claims that an ecumenical council can err. I see a whole lot of similarity with Martin Luther's heretical perspective there and some of the things that Lefebvre would have said about the papacy and also about the Second Vatican Council having erred. There's a lot of similarities there. So I find it curious that he's using Luther to criticize the Roman Rite, whereas I think we could find some similarities between Lefebvre and Luther to criticize some aspects of Lefebvre.
In the hand, the vernacular, these kinds of things.
All right, so some of the things that he's criticizing are communion in the hand. Well, I just did a video, Is Communion in the Hand Sacrilegious? Go and watch it, because communion in the hand was the venerable practice of the first millennium. So you can't just blanket outright condemn this. Now, he doesn't say I condemn it, but he's associating it with a heretic, Martin Luther. So he's obviously giving it a negative judgment. But if you're going to do that, you have to indict the apostles and the Christians of the first millennium. So just be consistent here. And then the vernacular. The vernacular was incredibly prevalent in the East. And so there's a very strong tradition for the vernacular way before Martin Luther. And there's really good arguments for having the liturgy in the vernacular. Unfortunately, he's not going to engage any of that. He's just going to associate communion in the hand, vernacular, all with Martin Luther, and just, say that, these are bad things, and these are instances of the spirit of Protestantism in the post-conciliar liturgy, when those are not elements unique to Protestantism. Those are very traditional elements. And this is what they do. They often point to things that are very traditional, and they will call it Protestant, because they tend to be very unaware of the traditional aspect or nature of a lot of these things they're criticizing. And they're seeing abuses of them, so they end up overshooting and overreacting against them. Okay.
And the intentionality behind those, the table altars and so forth. And you just get into it. And I went, oh,
Table altars. I mean, look, if you're speaking of a table altar, to exclude any kind of notion of Eucharistic sacrifice, that's problematic. But what is the biblical way of describing this? The Lord's table. And you find this concept of the table over and over in church history. In and of itself, there's nothing wrong with describing the altar that way. If you're doing it, however, with the intention of excluding any kind of Eucharistic sacrifice, then yeah, there's a problem there. But the Roman Rite in the post-conciliar era is not doing that, because it preserves the nature of the Eucharistic sacrifice and that language. So simply having more of an emphasis on it being a table and a meal is very biblical and very traditional, as long as you also maintain that this is also an altar. They're not against each other. It's not a either or error. It's a both and thing. And it's whenever you try to de-emphasize one to the exclusion of the other that you get into problematic territory. So whenever you overemphasize the altar aspect to the exclusion of the table and fellowship and communal aspect, that too is a problem, because that too is part of sacred tradition and divine revelation itself. So the very thing that Protestants are doing when they de-emphasize the Eucharistic sacrifice, guys like Kennedy and others unfortunately do. They just do it on the opposite side. They overemphasize the Eucharistic sacrifice to the exclusion of the communal meal, the table, and things like that. But both of those things should be retained, because both of those are part of sacred tradition.
my goodness, this is the new mass. This spirit of resistance to tradition, protestation against the history of the church.
I found that interesting. Resistance to tradition. When you de-emphasize these aspects that I've been mentioning, participation of the faithful, isn't that a resistance to tradition? When you de-emphasize and even go against an ecumenical council and its teachings, as some in the society do, and its founders certainly did, isn't that a resistance to tradition? Since when has it ever been traditional to reject teachings of an ecumenical council, or to reject parts of a profession of faith that Lefebvre and many in the society do today? Since when has that ever been traditional? Since when has it been traditional to oppose the Holy Father's will in consecrating bishops? I just find this ironic that we have a discussion of spirit of resistance here, when it seems like that's one of the problems of people who are formally adhering to the society in the way that Kennedy does, because he's already indicated, and later on in the video, that he's becoming part of their third order. So it's very clear he formally adheres to this stuff. When you formally adhere to this, you're formally adhering to a spirit of resistance against not only the Catholic Church, but many of its traditions, unfortunately.
This Protestant spirit is the animating force behind the reforms of the new Mass. This is a matter of historical record. This is not, we can't go in this in complete depth here. Once you realize that, once you come to believe that, how can you go to that? How can you attend that thing? Again, going back to this idea of we attend the Mass to sanctify the Lord's Day. We don't attend Mass primarily to receive the Eucharist.
For him, it's either or. Nothing about offering a sacrifice of praise and presenting yourself as a living sacrifice of praise and community synaxis. Again, none of that. It's just either or for Kennedy. And it's, again, because the liturgical expression that he's used to de-emphasizes these aspects of sacred tradition.
We were talking on messaging back and forth because I remember reading somewhere in the Eastern Code of Canon Law that essentially it says in the Eastern Code of Canon Law, because they use a different Code of Canon Law. And by the way, in the Eastern Code of Canon Law, they don't have late sententia excommunications. That's the whole Marcel Lefebvre question. So people act like it's this thing that's binding in perpetuity. The Eastern Code doesn't even have it. So it's not even universal.
That has absolutely nothing to do with the question of whether or not that excommunication that I'm sorry, not Martin Luther, but Marcel Lefebvre received, which I already addressed in the video that I referenced earlier, my concerns with the SSPX and Marcel Lefebvre. So go and watch that video for more detail. But that excommunication that he incurred there, Kennedy's trying to say it's not perpetual because it's not the universal understanding in all codes of canon law. That's irrelevant. It just has to be something that's part of the canon law that Lefebvre was under. And Lefebvre was under the code of canon law in the Roman Rite. The Eastern churches has nothing to do with canonical penalties for Lefebvre. So, in other words, somebody could receive a canonical penalty if they're under the code of canon law for the Roman churches and not receive that canonical penalty if they were under an Eastern church that's sui juris, who has a different code of canon law, who doesn't have that penalty. But Marcel Lefebvre is in the Roman Rite. And so it doesn't matter if it's not universal as far as a canon law. It just matters, is this something that Marcel Lefebvre was under? And the obvious answer is yes. He wasn't part of the Eastern churches. And so the Eastern Code of Canon Law has nothing to do with him.
It says you're required to go to, basically you're required to go to an Eastern Rite of Eastern Europe, how they would sanctify the Lord's Day as an Eastern Catholic. But they're not sinning by not going to Mass, as long as they're sanctifying, because there is an exceptionality. As part of the Eastern Church, they're owed the sacraments in the Eastern Rite.
And Catholics in the Roman Rite have the sacraments in the Roman Rite in the Missal of Paul VI. So this isn't analogous with anything with the Eastern churches. But watch this next part.
And if they're not there, then they seek for other means.
But they are there because Novus Ordo churches with the Roman Rite are available to the vast majority of Roman Rite Catholics.
Essentially, to sanctify the Lord's Day. So these things, even today in the church, there are Catholics who would be not in any dubious canonical standing, who would have permission from some sort of Eastern authority that they don't have to go to the Novus Ordo and instead could, pray a Vespers service instead.
But that's for those who are under the code of canon law of the Eastern churches. That has nothing to do with the people he's addressing that are part of the Roman Rite.
True spiritual advantage suggests it. So right there, this is actually pretty good. I mean, the law is concerned with the true spiritual advantage in this case. Why is that? Well, because you have to you have to be in a good spiritual place to go to heaven. So spiritual advantage is not just, again, we've been so beaten down by the terrible, liturgical nonsense that, for so many, I remember being at these.
Kennedy acts like these significant liturgical abuses are just prevalent everywhere in the Roman Rite, and they're not. And even again, in his own experience, he admits at the 56-minute, 40-second mark, roughly, he admits that his own experience of the Roman Rite wasn't like that. It was relatively, blah. It wasn't just full of liturgical abuses, significant ones. But here he's going to try to use Canon 844, paragraph 2.
Conferences. And how many times did I hear the speakers, people would ask, hey, how do you get your kids to go to mass? And the speaker would say, listen, I know, the music's terrible and the sermons are boring and, blah, blah, blah. And everyone kind of roll their eyes, but it's like, but it's the mass. You gotta tell your kids it's the mass and then go, and I was good natured and everything. But I remember thinking to myself, why are we so okay with just, how did we get to this point where we've just resigned ourselves to the fact that we're going to expect bad liturgy and heresy?
Why does he automatically translate Novus Ordo as bad liturgy and heresy? And then number two, there were plenty of people in the preconciliar era that attended the missal of John the 23rd and very much felt out of place, did not connect with it. They felt it was bad liturgy. Sometimes it was celebrated in a very bad way. And so couldn't they make the same argument?
I mean, that's really messed up. So I think we've become almost so indifferent in a sense, almost as a survival mechanism. But Code of Canon Law.
All right, watch this where he gets into the Code of Canon Law.
It talks about, when necessity requires it. So necessity is relative, or true spiritual advantage requires.
Necessity is relative? I'm not so sure that necessity canonically is relative, but okay.
Requires it. Suggests it. This is relative.
I'm not so sure that that's also, relative. Is the Code of Canon Law really this loosey-goosey and relative?
You can even go to a non-Catholic minister. Now, I'm not even saying do that.
So he's actually against the Code of Canon Law here while trying to use and make a point from the Code of Canon Law while rejecting the entire logic behind it.
Now, it says here for physical and moral impossibility. What does that mean? Well, physical impossibility is what we talked about. You're sick. It's physically impossible for you to go to mass, to approach a Catholic minister, right? That would include going to mass. Moral impossibility means there's an affront to a true spiritual advantage.
You could interpret it that way, but a lot of people are going to say a moral impossibility here would be like your parents forbid you and you're still under their authority as a child or something like that. They forbid you from attending a particular liturgy or something like that.
This is the same example of the Father Bob analogy with his heavy metal liturgical dancer mass. There's no chance of a true spiritual advantage there.
I mean, the vast majority of Catholics aren't having to deal with that kind of mass. So why continue to present that as if that's what the majority of people are dealing with? They're not. But again, for Kennedy, he admits later on that even the liturgy, when it's done properly and reverently ad orientem and in Latin, he's still going to say the entire, you shouldn't even be there because it's still a Protestant liturgy. So even if we take away his, painting with a broad brush here unfairly of all the Roman Rite liturgies, painting them out to be full of all these massive liturgical abuses, even if we put that to the side and just ask him, well, Kennedy, what do you think about something that's celebrated appropriately? He's going to go right there with Lefebvre and the society who say, no, you can't even go to those. It's still an offense to God, as the society is going to say. So a liturgy done properly, celebrated reverently, is still an offense to God because it's imbibed with the spirit of Protestantism, even in the Latin edition, according to Kennedy.
Because you're going to want to clobber everybody by the time it's go for Holy Communion, or you're going to be weeping the whole time. And it's morally impossible for you to take part in it. In that case, the church says for
the majority of Roman Catholics are not experiencing that.
True spiritual advantage, you could even seek out a priest who's not Catholic. I'm not saying do anything of the sort. But if it's saying there's a moral impossibility, to approach a Catholic minister, that implies that there's a moral that you could just not go to that minister.
Yeah, there are some cases when it's physically or morally impossible to approach a Catholic minister. You could approach a non-Catholic minister who has valid orders. That's all the canon is saying.
Meaning you just would have to not go to that place, which could mean hypothetically not going to mass that Sunday if there is a moral impossibility in your way.
But the vast majority of Catholics aren't up against those kinds of problems where they have that moral or physical impossibility. They're not experiencing just such radical abuses against the Catholic faith that they shouldn't attend. So they're keeping people away from the sacraments, unfortunately. And that's a very, very dangerous position. And that's one of the reasons why I'm willing to address this group.
Meaning you just would have to not go to that place, which could mean hypothetically not going to mass that Sunday if there is a moral impossibility in your way, or if there is a spiritual advantage to not going. Think about it this way. If you're traveling and the only mass that's going on is Slim Jim Martin's mass.
Notice he's again pointing to incredibly rare instances and is trying to use that to justify an overall position that says you shouldn't go to the Novus Ordo, even when it's properly celebrated.
It's a spiritual advantage for you because of moral impossibility to not go at all.
All right, now let's move to his comments about the Eastern liturgy that I found interesting.
If there was an Eastern Catholic liturgy around, or a Novus Ordo, I would 100% go to the Eastern Catholic liturgy because I would not be worried about there being an imbibing of a Protestant spirit, especially.
Okay, but would he then likewise also critique the Eastern liturgy for not having as much of an emphasis on the Eucharistic sacrifice and instead, although it's there, emphasizing other aspects to the liturgy and community and participation of the faithful and words like holy table and things like that? Is he going to take those same arguments, the vernacular, and is he going to then apply that to the Eastern liturgies? Because you could say a lot of the things that he would critique about the Roman Rite and the post-conciliar era, you could also say of the Eastern liturgies. I wonder why he's not going to critique them, but he will critique the Roman Rite. I wonder if it's that he just hasn't really experienced the Eastern liturgies that much. That's why I say I think that that's really a cure for this kind of overemphasis and overreaction against the post-conciliar reforms that you find in guys like Kennedy. A huge cure for that is just attend Eastern liturgies.
If a priest believes that going to the new mass is something you have to offer up, he's saying that there's something deficient, offensive, troubling.
If a person only has access to the TLM and they don't connect with it, should they offer that up? You would probably say, or Kennedy would probably say, no, you just need to understand the liturgy better. Okay. Well, likewise, you just need to understand the post-conciliar liturgy a little bit better instead of saying that you have to offer this up.
Loyal Catholic says, I've seen a baptism with a water gun. Yeah, that's pretty bad. I've never seen that. You know what's funny? I never actually, I gave that little story about the sort of eco service thingy, but that was really rare. To be honest, my experience with the new mass was pretty run of the mill. It was never massively scandalous on every occasion. That wasn't why I sought out tradition. I just sought out tradition because I just wanted tradition.
Notice that he equates tradition with the preconciliar liturgy of John the 23rd, as opposed to the post-conciliar reforms to the liturgy. So, objectively speaking, even though he didn't have that many bad experiences, they were all relatively decent Novus Ordos. Still, objectively speaking, these don't really carry out tradition. They're infused with Protestant heresy. That's effectively the position of Kennedy Hall, which he's just getting from the society itself. And that's harmful and dangerous. And that is why I think we need to be aware of the fact that you have a lot of people who have bought into this position from the society, whether they're formally adhering to the society or not. They've bought into their position. And that's concerning, because once you believe that Rome has abandoned tradition and is now giving you a doctrinally deficient and even heretical liturgy that's harmful to souls and is an offense to God, it's only a matter of time before um you're going to fall away from Catholic communion, because you're going to say, I'm not going to be fully united with a community that is trying to harm my soul. And that is why we have to know the problems of apologists who would present to us this very doctrinally deficient position that frankly falls under theological censors. When you say that a liturgy can be harmful to souls, and the church is promulgating a liturgy harmful to souls, and you're talking about on the universal level, when you say that the church has done this in the Roman Rite, that's an error in theology. A really good book for that, by the manualist Monsignor Van Noort, brings this out with the disciplinary decrees of the church, which also includes its liturgy. It's an error in theology to state that the church can offer something that's harmful to souls. And that's why we need to be aware of this danger. And also because it's keeping people away from the sacraments unnecessarily, and that's certainly harmful to souls. All right, I hope this was helpful. If so, hit that like button and the subscribe button, and be sure to check me out, patreon.com/reason and theology. We'll see you later. God bless.
Oh wait, before you go, I would really appreciate it if you would consider supporting this channel. This is my primary means to provide for my family, and it also helps me to produce content like this video. If you would like to support me, become a patron by visiting patreon.com/reason and theology. You'll also get access to extra exclusive content when you become a patron. Lastly, hit that like button and the subscribe button, and be sure to leave a comment down below. God bless.